Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. I'm joined now by John Guandolo, who's founder of Understanding the Threat. He's been writing over the last week about the protests that have been taking place in Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., Santa Monica, California, across the country. So, John, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be on with you again, Cal.
I think that people are expressing their concerns about policing, and I think that that is quintessentially American. But what you're seeing is radical far-left groups infiltrating these protests and rioting, looting, attacking people, literally killing people. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing and the connections that you're drawing to the people who are behind all of the attacks.
I want to maybe take a different perspective because our analysis and my analysis of this is it wasn't peaceful protests that have been hijacked. From the very beginning, this was a coordinated effort across the United States by Marxist communist groups and jihadi terrorist groups. So you've got Antifa and Black Lives Matter, which are both communist organizations inside the United States. And I want to be clear on this. There are citizens who support Black Lives Matter who are in it because they want the kind of things you're talking about. Mm-hmm. They want liberty. They want to make sure things are done right. Okay, that's great. But the leadership of Black Lives Matter, the entire reason the organization was formed, it was formed as a Marxist communist organization. And so when we know that, it means that the activities that it participates in, you've got to look at it through that lens. So you've got spontaneous, and I'm putting that in air quotes, protests in dozens of U.S. cities where it's immediately violent, where the people are armed, where we now know they're pre-staging pallets of bricks, where you now have police officers who have been shot in several cities. These are violent communist protests, riots, and they are doing it in conjunction at the ground level and at the state level and at the national level with terrorist groups like Hamas.
Let's back up for a second. So you say Antifa is a communist organization. If you read the media, they try and portray them as far right. And therefore, the next logical step is, well, they're Trump supporters. And so what you're seeing is if you see that white person throwing a brick through the window of the black business owner in Minneapolis, well, that's a Trump supporter. Get specific about Antifa and Black Lives Matter. When you say they're communist organizations, what is their objective?
Because they're communist organizations, their objective is to overthrow the U.S. government. That's their ultimate objective. Antifa is not only the main focus, they are one of a number of communist organizations in the United States, but they're certainly not the biggest. I mean, Freedom Road Socialist Organization and its Liberation Organization, its kind of new offshoot, are behind what's happening right now in the United States. And I think we need to understand that there's much more going on. This is a war right now that is primarily focused, and I'm very glad you brought up the U.S. media, because the U.S. media is a part of this movement, and they are hostile, and it's a movement that has many tentacles. And the issue is when I sit down with senior government leaders and lay this out for them, I mean, their heads explode, and they realize this is as detailed and as ingrained here in the United States as is the Islamic movement, the jihadi movement.
Are you telling me that they are not aware of this and somebody in the U.S. government is not putting this together?
Exactly. It's exactly what I'm telling you. I mean, we have people in the government that when we talk about Black Lives Matter being a communist organization, they look at you and you just say, okay, let's look at the three founders, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza, Marxists. These are people that have had senior leadership positions in Freedom Road Socialist Organization, for instance. It's not to say that every person in America that goes out to a Black Lives Matter event is a communist, but It was formed by communists. They want anarchy. They want the chaos. What they're doing on the streets today is communist doctrine, because when the chaos happens, then what you get is a need for order, law and order. And communism is a system that brings order to the community, but it also brings enslavement, totalitarianism, economic depravity. I mean, all of that. And Americans somehow think this can't happen here. And it's happening right now. We're watching it happen.
So this week, President Trump designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. From the DOJ FBI perspective, what specifically does that mean?
I think the biggest outcome of what he did by doing that was he laid it out on the table, calling Antifa terrorists, which they are. And so if nothing else, because this is a war in the information battle space, if you will, what he did was he basically just threw it down on the table. And if nothing else comes out of it other than that, in this war, that's a big deal. Now, for some people, you're like, well, that you're making it sound like there's no effect. There can be legal effects of this, but the way the laws are written and the way the State Department and the Treasury work on these things, what it really does is it focuses federal agencies on these organizations, but they will end up using other criminal violations to go after them.
Do you feel like the federal government, the people that you're talking to, are starting to understand, or are they still in denial?
Yes. The president is starting to see how these things are connected. I can tell you from people that we have worked with, the thing that has been lacking. And so, I want to be very clear. You would be shocked at how grossly ignorant leaders in these organizations are. 2008, when I was recruited out of the FBI by the DOD, they had me briefing 3- and 4-star generals, retired FBI, CIA directors, national security advisors, attorney generals, people like that, dozens of members of Congress, chairman of committees like the Homeland Security Committee, Intel Committee. And I briefed these people, and not a one of them understood anything about the U.S. communist movement, but specifically the Islamic movement in the United States, how they operate, and most importantly, how broad the network is, how deeply ingrained it's in our society, and how they work together, communists and jihadis. And for me, a guy who was a Marine Corps captain, not a real senior rank, an FBI special agent for about 13 years, not an executive in the government. It was shocking to me to be talking to men and women who held these positions and had no understanding of it, that the way that these movements operate in the United States is their goal is to control the narrative, to control how our leaders understand what they're doing. Is, for instance, the average leader, the average senior leader in the U.S. government from any of the components of government, their understanding of Islam is exactly opposite of what 10-year-old Muslim children are taught in U.S. Islamic schools about Islam. And so you have to ask yourself, now, how did that happen? And that's what I'm talking. It's the same with the communist movement. When you tell someone in the government that Black Lives Matter is a Marxist communist movement as a matter of objective fact, they just don't know this. And so it changes. Then, of course, they're like, well, why are we meeting with them? That's my question, sir. Why are you meeting with them? Why are you giving them legitimacy?
All right. Well, John Guandolo, founder of Understanding the Threat, thanks for joining me. And I know we're going to be talking more because I think it's hard for people to comprehend, but I think it's the absolute truth. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll be right back.